On his 17th birthday, a boy was handed a bus ticket and told not to come back. What waited for him at the end of a coastal road wasn't just a crumbling lighthouse nobody wanted. It was the answer to every question he had ever been afraid to ask. If you've ever felt like the people who were supposed to protect you were the first ones to leave you behind, hit that subscribe button. This story is for you. The day I turned 17, the world gave me two things: a one-way bus ticket and a name I had never heard spoken out loud in my own house. My stepmother Diana stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the particular way that meant the conversation was already finished before it began. She had a black trash bag sitting by the back door. It was not full. That was the part that stayed with me longest. Not the eviction, not the cold way she said it, but the fact that 17 years of living in a house could be reduced to something that wasn't even heavy enough to need two hands. The bag held 2 pairs of jeans, a handful of t-shirts, a worn paperback about a man who rebuilt an old boat from salvage, and a photograph of my father taken before he was sick, standing in front of something I couldn't quite make out at the edge of the frame, something tall and white, one hand shielding his eyes against a bright sky. I had carried that photograph for 3 years without understanding what was behind him. Diana told me my father had left me something in his will, and that she had no interest in contesting it, which was the closest she came to generosity that morning. She handed me a manila envelope. She said, "Good luck, Eli," and turned back toward the kitchen counter before the words were finished leaving her mouth. Outside, the sky was low and yellow-gray, the kind of morning that can't decide between rain and fog, and settles for both. A thin mist moved through the street in slow drifts. I stood on the front step with the trash bag in one hand and the manila envelope in the other, and I listened to the sound of the door closing behind me, the latch clicking into place with a small, clean finality. I tucked the envelope inside my coat and started walking toward the transit station 4 blocks over. I did not open it yet. I needed to be somewhere else first. Somewhere that wasn't that street, wasn't that neighborhood, wasn't the particular gray air of everything I was leaving. I had no idea the envelope inside my coat was about to change everything. I found the office of Mr. Arthur Abernathy on the 2nd floor of a narrow building near the waterfront district. Up a staircase that creaked with every step and smelled of old paper and furniture polish and something faintly briny, like the sea had worked its way into the walls over decades and decided to stay. The door was ajar. I knocked on the frame. A voice told me to come in. He was an older man, compact and deliberate, with thin white hair combed neatly to one side and a neatly trimmed white beard and wire spectacles. He looked at me over, rather than through. His desk was covered in folders stacked with a precision that suggested a very particular kind of mind. The window behind him showed a gray rectangle of harbor water, flat and still under the morning mist. He did not offer condolences. He pulled a folder from the stack and folded his hands on top of it and said my full name once, as though confirming something to himself. And then he began. My father, Thomas Vance, had died 14 months prior. He had left no liquid assets, no savings of consequence, no vehicle. What he had left, sole and entire, was a property on the northern coastal road outside the town of Heron's Point, a lighthouse decommissioned by the Maritime Authority 11 years ago, sitting on 2.5 acres of coastal headland. There was no road access beyond the last quarter mile, which was unpaved and prone to washout. The structure had been cited for deteriorating masonry on the exterior tower. The Maritime Authority had declared the light mechanism itself federal property and removed it years ago, leaving behind the shell of the tower and the keeper's dwelling attached at the base. To claim the deed, I owed $5 in outstanding transfer fees. He looked at me over his spectacles and said nothing for a moment. Then he opened a second envelope and withdrew a single sheet of paper. A company called Titan Holdings had already been in contact with his office. They were prepared to offer $5,000 for the parcel, as is, no conditions, closing within 30 days. He slid the sheet across and let it sit between us. He said he was obligated to present it. He said nothing more than that. I looked at the number, $5,000. I was 17 years old, with a trash bag of clothes, a bus ticket, and no address. $5,000 was a year of somewhere to sleep. It was food that didn't come from wherever was cheapest. It was the thing that stood between me and the kind of winter that got inside you and never fully left. I sat with it. I felt the logic of it pressing down on me from every direction, the way water presses on something submerged. Then I thought about the photograph, the tall white thing at the edge of the frame. My father, with his hand over his eyes, squinting into the brightness of it. "I'm not selling," I said. It came out quieter than I intended. "I want to see it first." Mr. Abernathy looked at me for a moment without expression, then wrote me a receipt for $5, told me the deed would be registered by end of week, and gave me directions to the Herons Point transit stop. It was the stupidest decision I had ever made. It was the best. The bus north left in the early afternoon and ran for 3 hours through country that started flat and gray and slowly grew wilder. The trees pressing closer to the road, the hills steepening, the light changing from the washed-out yellow of the city to something cooler, cleaner, a blue-white clarity that came off the water whenever the road curved near the coast. The sea appeared and disappeared between tree lines, dark and enormous flashing silver where the light caught it. The smell coming through the cracked window vent changed too, exhaust giving way to pine, then salt, then the deep cold mineral smell of coastal stone. I found a payphone at a fuel stop outside Caraway and called my brother Caleb. He was still at the house, still 14, still sleeping in the room next to mine with the baseball pennants on the wall and the gap under the door where the draft came through in winter. He picked up on the third ring. I told him I was going north, that there was property that our father had left it to me. He was quiet for a long time. He asked if there was enough room for 2 people. I told him there was a tower and a house attached to it, and I was going to fix whatever needed fixing, and I was going to make it work. I told him I would come back for him when it was ready. "I will," I said. "I promise." I heard him breathe slowly on the other end of the line the way he did when he was being careful with something. He said, "Okay, Eli, be careful." The bus horn sounded from across the lot. I ran. The Herons Point transit stop was a wind shelter with a bench and a hand-lettered timetable nailed to a post. The town itself was 4 blocks of storefronts, a harbor with a dozen fishing boats, and a diner called Martha's at the corner of the main road and the coastal highway. I went in because I needed directions and because the cold coming off the water had worked through my coat during the walk from the stop. A woman behind the counter with silver hair pulled back and the kind of face that has seen every kind of weather and been surprised by none of it, looked me over once and said, "Nothing." I asked about the Lighthouse property on the northern road. She stopped moving. She said the name slowly, Vance. I told her Thomas Vance was my father. She looked at me for a long moment, then poured a coffee without being asked and set it in front of me and said, "Your father came in here every time he made the drive up. Good man, fought harder for that light than the county thought was reasonable." She paused. Then she said there was a man named George who ran the hardware store 2 doors down, who knew the road and owed her a favor. She picked up the phone. George drove a pickup that had been repaired, more than it had been manufactured, and said nothing at all for the first 20 minutes, which I appreciated. When we turned off the coastal highway onto the unpaved track, he mentioned that the last quarter mile was rough in wet weather, and that he'd leave me where the track ended at a gate. He did. I climbed the gate and walked the last stretch alone through wind-bent coastal grass, the ground soft underfoot, the sea invisible below the headland, but audible, constant, something between a breath and a roar. Then the track crested a rise, and I stopped. The lighthouse stood at the edge of the headland, against the sky that had gone pewter and white. It was taller than I had expected. The tower rose from the keeper's dwelling in a column of rough stone, and rendered masonry maybe 70 feet, its white paint stripped back to bare gray in long vertical patches by years of coastal weather. The lantern room at the top was dark, the lens long removed, the iron railing around the gallery corroded to the color of dried blood. The keeper's dwelling below was 2 stories, compact with a slate roof that had lost 3 or 4 tiles on the seaward side and a front door that had swollen shut in its frame. 2 of the ground floor windows were intact. One was not. What I saw waiting for me there on that headland made me want to turn around and walk back to the gate and get back on the bus and take the $5,000 and never think about any of this again. I'm glad I didn't. The key from Mr. Abernathy's envelope was iron, long and heavy, the kind made to last a century. I worked it into the lock of the keeper's dwelling and turned. The lock resisted, then ground slowly through its tumblers, and then there was a deep, satisfying clunk of a bolt drawing back, and the door scraped open against the swollen frame. A wave of cold air rolled out to meet me, thick with the smell of damp stone and salt and rust and something underneath it all, a deeper smell, the smell of sealed-in time of rooms that had been waiting. The interior of the dwelling was dim, the light coming in weak and gray from the two intact windows, falling in long rectangles across stone floors thick with grit and the fine chalky dust of deteriorating plaster. The ceilings were low, the rooms small and purposeful. A main room with a cold iron stove, a narrow kitchen behind it, a staircase at the back wall rising to the upper floor, and beyond a reinforced door at the base of the tower itself, the lighthouse stairs. I stood in the center of the main room and listened. The wind moved around the exterior of the tower with a low resonant hum, like something held in a great hollow vessel. The sound was not unpleasant. It was the sound of something that had been built to stand and had stood. I tried the tower door. It was unlocked. The interior of the tower was a stone cylinder rising above me and a tight helix of iron stairs bolted to the inner wall, winding upward into dimness. I began to climb. The stairs rang faintly under my feet, each step a small announcement in the silence. At the first landing, nothing but a narrow window slot looking seaward. At the second, a rusted bracket where equipment had once been mounted. At the third landing, halfway up, I stopped. The wall here was different. I noticed it because the stone on the outer curve of the tower was the same rough-dressed granite as the rest of the interior, but on the inner curve, at a section roughly 6 feet wide, the surface was smoother, too smooth. And at the edge of that section, barely visible in the dim light from the window slot above, a seam ran vertically from floor to ceiling of the landing platform. I pressed along it with my fingers. The stone gave nothing. I ran my hand along the base of the smooth section and felt it, a shallow indentation, not a handle, not a latch, just a carved recess the size of a thumb. I pressed. There was a sound like something releasing deep inside the wall, a mechanical exhalation, and the smooth section swung inward 2 inches on concealed hinges and stopped. I pulled it open the rest of the way with both hands. The air that came out was different from the rest of the tower, dry, still. The vault behind the wall was a low-ceilinged chamber, no more than 8 feet deep and 6 feet across, built into the thickness of the tower's base at the landing level. It was not empty. Along the left wall, on built-in stone shelves, stood a row of metal strongboxes, 8 of them, sealed with combination locks. On the right wall, hanging from iron pegs, were rolled maritime charts, oilskin wrapped, and below them on a small built-in shelf, a brass sextant in a fitted wooden case, a ship's chronometer, and instruments I could not name but that were clearly old and clearly precise. And in the center of the vault's floor, sitting on a folded canvas cloth, was a wooden crate with a handwritten label in faded ink. The label said simply, "For Eli, when you are ready." My mind refused to process what I was seeing. I stood at the entrance to the vault with one hand on the stone doorframe and looked at my name written in my father's handwriting on a wooden crate inside a hidden room in the middle of a lighthouse tower, and something cracked open in my chest that I could not immediately identify or control. I sat down on the landing step outside the vault and put my hands over my face. The sound that came out of me echoed off the stone walls and spiraled upward into the dark column of the tower. I stayed there for a long time. When I finally stood and went back into the vault and opened the crate, the first thing I found was an envelope. Beneath it, packed in straw, were the combination locks' numbers written on a card in a sealed inner sleeve. And beneath that, wrapped in oilcloth, a second package I set aside for the moment. I opened the envelope, and at the bottom of the crate beneath the last layer of straw, I saw something else. A leather journal, thick, its cover darkened with handling, a length of cord tied around it to keep it closed. I left it for the moment. I read the letter first. It began with my name, just my name on a line by itself, the way he used to say it when something was serious. Eli, if you found this, you made it here. That matters more than you know. It means you didn't take the easy way. It means you are your father's son. I set the letter down. Read that sentence again. Set it down again. He wrote that he had known, 2 years before he died, that the illness would take him before I was old enough to protect myself. He had known also that Diana would not keep me. He did not write this with bitterness. He wrote it as a fact he had worked around, the way a builder works around a load-bearing wall that cannot be moved. He had spent the last 2 years of his life doing 2 things simultaneously: receiving treatment and quietly, methodically, transferring everything of value into forms that could not be touched by probate, by inheritance dispute, or by a stepmother who would inherit the house and its contents, but had no legal claim to a separate deeded property. He wrote that the lighthouse had belonged to his own father before him and to his father's father before that. The Maritime Authority had decommissioned the light, but had never disputed private ownership of the land or the structure itself. What the Maritime Authority did not know, and what my father had paid to have surveyed quietly 4 years before his death, was that the headland on which the lighthouse stood included, in its 2.5 deeded acres, a strip of coastal cliff access that the county had been seeking to acquire for 11 years for a public coastal trail easement. The county had believed the land was state property. The survey proved otherwise. The right-of-way access alone, my father wrote, was worth considerably more than anyone had offered for the parcel. But the survey had also revealed something else. At the base of the headland, below the tide line but accessible at low water through a sea cave at the property's southern edge, there existed a natural harbor pocket, sheltered on 3 sides by rock, deep enough at mean tide for small vessel mooring and entirely within the private property boundary. There was not another natural mooring site of comparable protection for 14 miles in either direction along that coastline. Commercial fishermen had been asking the Maritime Authority for access to it for decades. The authority had always told them it was inaccessible on public land. It was not public land. It had never been public land. My father wrote that the 8 strong boxes on the vault shelf contained, collectively, $42,000 in cash, accumulated over 20 years by a man who had distrusted banks with the particular conviction of someone who had watched his own father lose everything to a failed one. He wrote that the sextant and chronometer were a matched set from the 1880s, commissioned for a naval survey vessel, and that a maritime museum in the capital had expressed interest in acquiring them through a dealer contact, whose name and number were in the journal. He wrote that the charts on the wall were original hand-drawn coastal surveys from the same era, and that their value was for someone more patient and knowledgeable than him to determine, but that the museum contact would know. He ended the letter this way: "The vault is yours, the land is yours, and the view from the top of that tower on a clear morning is yours too, and that one is not worth any amount of money anyone will ever offer you. Go up there before you do anything else." His final line was underlined twice, slowly and deliberately. "Don't let them take the light from you. That's what they always want. Don't let them." I folded the letter and put it in my coat pocket. Then I climbed the rest of the stairs to the top of the tower and stood in the empty lantern room, in the wind and the gray coastal light, and looked at the sea for a long time without thinking anything at all. The weeks after that were made of labor and cold, and something I had not felt in so long I almost didn't recognize it: purpose. I slept in the keeper's dwelling, in a sleeping bag with the wood stove going, fed with driftwood and deadfall from the coastal scrub. And each morning I started before the light was fully up. I patched the roof with tarp and timber salvaged from an outbuilding at the back of the property. I replaced the swollen front door with a new hung one George helped me source and fit one Saturday when he drove up the track in his truck with 3 planks of solid oak in the bed and said he'd heard I was fixing the place up and that it seemed like the right thing to do. My hands blistered across the palms from the handsaw and the hammer and went back to smooth and then calloused over again within a fortnight. I hauled fresh water from a rain cistern on the dwelling's north side until I got the plumbing partially functional with the help of a retired pipe fitter from Heron's Point named Henry, who had worked on older buildings all his life and said the plumbing was solid underneath the corrosion, just needed a reason to run again. Martha sent a box up with George, one afternoon, cast iron cookware, 2 enamel plates, a block of good soap, and a jar of coffee. No note. No explanation. I wrote her a letter and left it at the diner counter the next time I came down for supplies. She read it while I was there and said nothing except that she was glad the stove worked. I wrote to the museum in the capital using the contact name in my father's journal. A woman named Dr. Albright wrote back within 2 weeks, formally and then in a second letter, less formally. She said the sextant and chronometer were among the finest examples of the period she had encountered in private hands. She said the coastal survey charts were of significant historical and navigational record value. She proposed a purchase price for the collection. The number she offered for the instruments alone was $50,000. The charts, pending assessment, would be additional. Then Titan Holdings appeared again. A letter arrived forwarded through Mr. Abernathy. They had revised their position significantly. They were now offering $250,000 for the parcel, citing its potential for coastal residential development. 3 days later, a second letter arrived, not an offer, but a notice. They had filed a complaint with the county challenging the survey's accuracy and requesting a boundary review that, if granted, would have placed the southern mooring access outside the private property line. I called Mr. Abernathy from the payphone in Heron's Point and read him the notice over the phone. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Come in Thursday, bring the original survey and the deed." I walked into that meeting not knowing it would be the most important meeting of my life. There were two of them at the table in expensive suits with the polished patience of men who had negotiated many things and lost very few of them. They spoke about coastal development and community economic benefit and the burden of maintaining a heritage structure on a private income. They used the word partnership 3 times in 4 minutes. Then they pushed a figure across the table. $500,000. Clean transfer, full title. 30 days. The room was quiet. I looked at the number. I thought about climbing the lighthouse stairs in the cold dark with a flashlight, the iron ringing under my boots, the weight of the door swinging open on its hidden hinges, my name on a wooden crate in a sealed room inside a stone tower. I thought about Caleb in the room with the baseball pennants and the draft under the door. I thought about a man spending the last 2 years of his life quietly building a floor that would hold after he was gone. I said no. I laid the survey on the table. I explained, with Mr. Abernathy seated beside me, that the mooring access at the southern edge of the headland represented the only naturally sheltered small vessel harbor in a 14-mile stretch of working coastline, and that the commercial fishing operators currently based out of Heron's Point had been seeking protected mooring access for years. I said I was prepared to offer a long-term mooring access easement, not a sale, not a transfer of any kind, to a cooperative of local fishing operators at below-market rates administered through a trust to be established in my father's name. I said this easement would be structured to preclude any competing commercial maritime development along the southern cliff axis for the duration of the agreement. I said the county's request for a coastal trail right-of-way easement along the headland would be granted at no charge, on the condition that the trail corridor be maintained by the county and remain non-commercial in perpetuity. I said Titan Holdings was welcome to make any further offers they wished through Mr. Abernathy's office, and that the answer would not change. The man on the left stopped writing. The man on the right straightened his papers with the deliberate care of someone who needed something to do with his hands. They thanked me for my time. They left without a number or a counteroffer or a timeline. Everyone in the room knew they had already lost. The easement agreements were signed 6 weeks later. The county trail easement closed the same week. The fishing cooperative's mooring access agreement was signed the week after that, and the first quarterly fee payment arrived at Mr. Abernathy's office before the ink was dry on the filing. The museum's payment for the instruments came through in a bank draft that I held in my hands for a long time before depositing it, because it felt important to understand what it was before it became a number on a statement. It was my father's foresight made liquid. It was 17 years of a man who loved the sea and trusted his son enough to leave him something real. I drove to the county offices on a Tuesday morning with the guardianship paperwork Mr. Abernathy had filed the month prior. Caleb came out the front doors with a duffel bag on one shoulder and the same careful expression he always used when he was deciding whether something was real. He looked at the truck. He looked at me. On the drive north, I told him about the vault, about the strong boxes, about the mooring access and the charts and the instruments in the letter. He listened without interrupting, which was how he had always listened to things that mattered. When we came over the rise and the lighthouse appeared at the end of the headland track, against a sky that had gone clear and pale blue for the first time since I'd arrived, he was quiet for a long moment. Then I flipped the switch inside the keeper's dwelling door and the overhead light came on. Real electricity, live current for the first time in that house in years. And Caleb stood in the doorway with the light falling on him and said, "We're home, Eli." And I knew by the way he said it that he meant it the same way I did. Not as a description of a place, but as the recognition of something that had already been true for a while and was only now being said out loud. I stand on the gallery railing at the top of the tower sometimes now in the early morning before Caleb is awake, with the sea below and the coastal light coming in low and silver from the east. And I think about my father standing in front of this tower with his hand over his eyes against the brightness. The photograph creased down the middle from years in the pages of a book. I think about a man who knew he was running out of time, and spent what was left of it not on himself, but on a floor that would hold. I think about a hidden room in the middle of a stone tower and a wooden crate with a name on it, waiting in the dark for someone ready enough to climb the stairs and find it. The most valuable things are not in the obvious places. They are behind the wall that looks like all the other walls. They are at the top of the stairs you almost didn't climb. An ending can become a beginning. A disownment can become a deed. What looks like nothing from the outside is sometimes, on the inside, everything. If you have ever felt like someone took something from you before you understood what it was worth, I want you to know that what belongs to you has a way of waiting. It is patient. It is in the foundation. It is in the lining. It is at the top of the stairs. Tell me in the comments about something a parent or grandparent left behind that you didn't understand until later. I read every single one. Thank you for listening.